Good morning, Angelina. Good morning to all the participants in Zoom and those who are seeing us on YouTube. My name is Mirjana Tomic, and I organize and moderate seminars and talk series on politics and media in Europe, and especially formulated for media representatives and academic researchers. I worked for two Vienna-based organizations, Forum for Journalism and Media, set up by the city of Vienna in support of quality journalism, and Presse Club Concordia, the oldest press club in the world, founded in 1859 and still very active protecting journalists and press freedom. My today's guest is Angelina Davydova, one of the most prominent Russian environmental and climate journalists currently residing in Berlin. You can see Angelina's impressive CV. There will be a link in the chat. Our today's topic is the impact of the war in Ukraine on both environment and climate. Environmental problems and climate change have not started with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but the impact of the war can make them worse. For example, and Angelina will explain this, Western sanctions against Russia have interrupted data exchange about climate and environment. Moscow scrapped many environmental laws and regulations as a result of the Western sanctions and the pressure of the local industries, unable to meet European environmental standards. These are only a few examples. The impact on environment and climate will be big in both Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and around the world. And the environment and climate cannot wait for political solutions. One can isolate Russia in many areas, economy, politics, academia, but not environmentally. Combating climate change requires cooperation that is currently absent in the light of the savage war. And yet, whatever happens in Russia's vast territory, from the melting ice in the Arctic to forest fires, affects the whole world, just like the Amazon forest does. Just to give an example, I know some of you are not in Europe, but yesterday, German news started not with the war in Ukraine. It started with how warm it will be in the coming days in Germany and in parts of Europe. It started about energy problems because Russia today, on the 11th of July, turned off the gas pipeline leading to Germany and parts of Europe, because they say they have to do some repairing work. And Ukraine was probably the fourth news. The format of the event just is the following. Angelina will give a 20 to 25 minute talk highlighting the main topics, and then we shall open the floor for live questions. The event will be recorded, and for those who are joining us for the first time, I would just like to say that these events are really meant to inspire you. They are meant also for creating a network among experts and journalists. Angelina, I thank you so much for being with us, and the screen is yours.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Mirjana, and thank you for inviting me to speak. It is indeed a great honor for me to be speaking on behalf of the organizers and also with your kind invitation. And I look forward to a very productive interaction. As Mirjana mentioned, I'll speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then I'll be open to questions. There are indeed numerous topics to cover and various aspects of both regional and global issues, some of which have already been mentioned in your introduction when you said what you heard and seen yesterday in German news. Indeed, many of these news items are connected with this ongoing war in Ukraine, which does change our life, does change the globe, and does change the political and economic and environmental and climate situations in so many contexts. Since we don't have that much time, I would like to cover just a number of topics and just give a very brief overview of possible lines of thoughts within what the environmental and climate consequences and environmental and climate costs of the war in Ukraine can be. And if we're trying to look at what has been happening for the last 4.5 months, Russia's invasion to Ukraine and all consequent decisions, including the sanctions, including embargo, that does reframe, that does transform many areas of our life. And that does influence quite a number of sectors, from food security to energy security, and from climate policy to many other policies, including in the metal sector, including in supply chains. So it's certainly something which once again reshapes the global world, and reshapes the global world straight away following the corona crisis, which is also possibly still with us. So if we speak about environmental consequences of the war in Ukraine, one can briefly divide them into two categories. And the first category would be immediate environmental consequences. And those would be connected with the pollution, soil pollution, pollution of rivers, pollution of air, and local pollution, which happens mostly on the area of Ukraine. So that would be one group of consequences. To this group, we can also mention, for example, destruction of urban and industrial infrastructure, which obviously leaves a very long-standing trace on the area of Ukraine, which will have to be dealt with straight away after the war is finished. And there are already quite a number of efforts in thinking about it. And I've been a member of quite a number of Ukrainian, Belarusian, or Russian international groups who are actually trying to both monitor the current ongoing environmental consequences, but also think about how these consequences can be dealt with, and how these consequences can be dealt with when the war is over, and also how we can think about green recovery of Ukraine. But that will probably be another topic, and I will not be speaking too much about it now. However, there's also a second group of consequences. And that second group of consequences has less of a direct character, and it's not so much connected with military actions per se, but those are the ones which also Mariana mentioned at the very beginning. Those are the ones which reshape our energy structure and energy consumption patterns. Those are also the ones which reshape environmental and climate policies of Russia, of Ukraine, and also quite a number of other countries involved. For example, those countries who've been mostly buying Russian oil, Russian gas, and now will have to make different decisions and other decisions. I will shortly concentrate now on the topic of what's happening in Russia, because as Mariana said, I originally come from Russia. Unfortunately, I had to leave the country in mid-March following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and my anti-war political position. And to start with this, I'll probably take one step back, and I'll give a very quick overview of what has been happening with Russia's climate actions and policies and strategies in the last few years. And as we know, Russia is the world's fifth largest greenhouse gas emitter, as a fifth or fourth largest, following China, the US, India, and then the European Union, if we count the European Union as one entity. And Russia's emissions, as well as emissions of many other post-Soviet countries, have gone down in the 90s due to economic collapse of the economy. And then they were more or less staying at the same level with some very modest growth in the last years. Still, Russia's emissions were not relevant for only Russia, because Russia was and still is as one of the largest world suppliers of oil, coal, and natural gas, and many other items and resources, from wood products to metals. And the interest towards the topic of climate change and towards climate agenda is a relatively new thing for Russia. Say, I started working with this topic. I started writing about this topic and talking about this around 2008. And that was the year when that topic was very little relevant for Russia. So in a way, climate change was not an interesting topic for Russia. It was considered to be somewhat marginal and attracted very little political and economic attention. However, that has changed in the last few years. And I have to say that within the last 2 years, in particular, say 2020, 2021, the whole topic of climate change and decarbonization became much more important within the Russian context. Now, why was that happening? For a number of reasons. one of those reasons was that Russia was truly observing more consequences of climate change also happening in its territory. Warming Arctic, melting permafrost, more fierce forest fires, and should also be noted also in this year, although it hardly comes into the news because of the war in Ukraine, there are disastrous forest fires in Siberia, in southern Siberia, southern Ural, and part of the far east region of Russia. They've been going on since mid-April, and this is a kind of topic and a kind of a problem which does not see to be ended anytime near in the next few years as we know it, and maybe dozens of years. It's something which stays with us, and it's also one of the problems which on one hand is caused by climate change, on the other hand makes climate change to be even worse and to be even more disastrous. Now, Russia was seeing more of these consequences. So that was more of an internal reason, and also an internal reason for Russia to do actually something in the area of climate adaptation. But on the other hand, there were also a number of trends, mostly international trends, which made Russia think more about climate mitigation or emission reduction. So greenhouse gases emission reduction. Now, what was that and why was that happening? Russia was seeing how many countries all over the world are turning towards decarbonization and are turning towards renewable energy, and also thinking of introducing possible trade tariffs in various forms on Russian oil and Russian gas. And one of this very interesting example is the European New Green Deal, the Green Deal program, which also implies an introduction of the so-called, I mean, it will probably sound rather technical, but I'll explain it. It's something called carbon border adjustment mechanism. What it means basically that all the goods and services which are produced outside of the European Union and then are being exported into the European Union. So for the European Union, they're import goods. If they have been produced within the countries which do not have carbon regulation, they'll have to pay a certain tariff, a sort of this adjustment mechanism to make it comparable with the European producers. Now, that has been a huge wake-up call for many Russian industries, from fertilizers to metals, and from aluminum producers, like other metals, electricity producers. So quite a number of sectors were coming under this regulation, and it was actually supposed to come into power in 2023, so next year. And this is why many Russian companies and many Russian businesses and also Russian government in general began thinking about what does it mean for our economy and the future of our economy. And I almost believe that the first serious conversations about what the future of Russia's decarbonized economy could be only really started about 2 or 3 years ago. But that was, once again, that was the situation before the war. Now, what has been happening since the war? You all know there are packages of sanctions coming one after another, and also some countries have been introducing embargoes on Russian oil and embargoes on Russian gas. That's also not a very easy story to actually to follow and introduce and to monitor. As you know, oil in general and Russian oil in particular can be transported in various ways. Via oil pipelines with tankers, or sometimes it's been traded via international dealers like oil traders, or sometimes it's also been traded directly, like country to country or company to company. And in many ways, to trace the origin of oil and to support the with documentation and certification which oil you're actually selling or reselling is quite complicated in the modern world. So what has been happening, it would also been seen, is that many European countries have been buying far less of Russian oil, but then many other countries, including India and China, have been buying far more of Russian oil in the next few months. And it should be noted that they are, in current market conditions, they've been buying less, the oil, more oil, but under cheaper prices. So the prices are much lower, 25 to 30%. However, what is also seen at international oil markets is that very often, for example, when Indian companies are buying Russian oil, then reselling it to someone else. So this is what's happening in the global oil markets. With gas, the situation is slightly different. because gas can be transported either by gas pipelines, and those is usually the kind of infrastructure which needs to be built and sustained, and it usually takes quite a while effort and money and investment, and also is timely, so you need quite some years to build this infrastructure. Or it can be also transported in its liquid form, so in form of LNG. And this is why we see quite a number, for example, of European Union countries aiming to buy new LNG terminals so that they can receive more natural gas, not from Russia, not by the Nord Stream pipeline, but from the US or from Qatar or from other parts of the world. Now, so in a way with gas, it does require more infrastructure and more efforts. On the other hand, it's also something which is easily traceable, because with gas, in a way, you can trace it more easily, much more easily than with the oil. Now, I mentioned quite a lot of economic consequences of the war and of the sanctions and the embargo. However, there are also other kinds of consequences. Russia, in terms of its area, is the largest country in the world and has various ecosystems from, as I mentioned earlier, from the permafrost to the steppes and vast forests, vast boreal forests. And with all the consequences of climate change, with the warming Arctic, with the melting permafrost, with the burning forest, it is indeed something which happens within Russia, does not stay in Russia. It has global consequences. And it's important on one hand to follow these global consequences, to understand what is happening in Russia, to get access to environmental and scientific data. And on the other hand, also think how these trends, how this catastrophes, how these negative consequences of climate change have a global impact and have a global impact on the global climate and the planet in general. And here we've also seen some disruptions following the sanctions and following a halt in many international cooperation programs, including scientific programs. We've been observing some issues and some disruptions with scientific information exchange. So most international cooperation projects, also scientific projects in Russia, done with the participation of Russian state institutions and Russian state agencies, have been either put on pause or canceled. And that does lead to the fact that on one hand, many Russian scientists and laboratories have limited access to international data on also on climate change. And on the other hand, Russian labs and Russian scientists also can provide lesser data on what's happening, for example, with the permafrost melting, what's happening with Arctic research. It is indeed a very worrying process. And as I mentioned, it does concern mostly state institutions. However, most of this large-scale scientific research is state-funded in Russia anyway, and it has been organized and has been managed by the state institutions. So it does not concern particular scientists, and I regularly speak to quite a number of scientists, also the ones who travel regularly, say, between Germany and Russia and engage in a number of scientific research programs. So if they act in their private capacity, they usually still continue work, but then access to information is somewhat limited, and it's certainly an issue which will have to be dealt in the future. And because, as I said, it's an issue of global concern, and it's also an issue of access to information, exchange of information, because in any way, a lot about what we know, how the climate is changing, like also a lot of the IPCC report is based on international exchange and exchange of international data. It should also be noted that Russia remains and Russian scientists remain to be part of the IPCC, and they continue their work in the IPCC. IPCC is the international panel, intergovernmental panel on climate change, and unites scientists from all over the world who prepare regular reports and regular overviews for the UN and for the politicians all over the world, showing how climate is changing and why is it changing, and also what kind of risks are appearing across various regions of the world, and also how can we adapt to these risks. And it should also be said, and I think it's actually a very important example, that when the war has started in late February, In early March, there was a big internal panel, a big internal discussion with the IPCC, with scientists from many countries coming together, including Russia, including Ukraine. And while Ukrainian scientists had to join Zoom talks, just the way we do now, in conditions with, when their cities were bombed, and also when Kyiv was under direct bombing, a number of Russian scientists who joined the talk expressed their opinion and said they're actually against the war and that they support their Ukrainian colleagues. I was present in some of these discussions, and I believe that was a very important statement. However, as you probably also get it from the news, recent political trends within Russia have also become very worrying. There's an increasing political pressure on any free speech from the side of activists, from the side of journalists, from the side of independent politicians, but also from the side of scientists. But going from science to, once again, to a more political area, and I think it's also a topic which Mirjana mentioned at the very beginning. Unfortunately, what we also see as an indirect consequence of the war in Ukraine is the rollback of environmental regulation in Russia. Russia's economy still has not fully realized the effects of the sanctions. It is actually expected that towards early fall, there will be more seen and more perceived effects of the sanctions on various sectors of Russian economy. However, most businesses and most companies have already become very much concerned and very much worried about these economic consequences. So what we see is that many of these companies and many of business associations have actually been pushing the government to ease up environmental regulations in many areas and roll back quite a number of standards and certificates and regulations which are actually put into place in the last few years. So just to give you an example, Russia has significantly eased regulation on vehicles and the production of vehicles. So nowadays, basically, even cars with the lowest environmental standards, including the so-called Euro 0 standard for engines and for fuel, can be produced in Russia, which is obviously not good news for local environmental pollution, but also for the global greenhouse gas emissions. Likewise, many regulation has been rolled back with regard to the environmental expertise and state environmental expertise and also public environmental expertise. Actually, serious hurdles and serious complications have been put up in the way of civil society groups who are trying to do independent environmental expertise in the last few years. And so the reason for that is that many companies, including developing companies and construction companies, are willing to build more infrastructure, and they just don't want to see any obstacles on their way. So in a way, what we see is this huge trend of taking out any environmental expertise with connection to urban construction, but also industrial construction, say construction of industrial infrastructure. Likewise, other rolling back of regulation is connected to oil processing. Here's a very interesting example. For the last few months, Russia has been having an excess of oil because it could not sell all the oil that it extracted. And currently in Russia, there are not enough facilities to store this oil and also to process this oil. So many oil companies have been pushing for easier rules to switch, for example, power plants from natural gas back to heavy oil, which is just to use all of it. This is, once again, not good news for local industrial pollution and air quality in the cities, but also not good news for greenhouse gas emissions, which obviously have global character. And likewise, as some of you probably know, whenever there's oil extraction next to oil and right next to an oil rigs, we usually also have something which is called which is natural gas, which comes right with the oil. And that gas, the flaring gas, has been, for many years, Russian companies have been burning it. And that once again was an environmentally damaging business practice, but also something which increased emissions of greenhouse gases in Russia and globally. Now, this practices, this climate damaging practices have been dealt with, and Russia has realized quite a number of projects, also with support of many international donor organizations, including the World Bank, when that flaring gas has been captured and then produced and into sort of plastics, which were later transported and sold to the European Union. Now that route of trade has stopped as well. And so now Russian oil companies are pushing again for the government to allow and burn that gas again, which once again will mean the more greenhouse gases to be released into the atmosphere and more local environmental pollution in the regions where it's actually happening. We see all of this, we observe all of this. There are still a number of environmental groups in Russia who are trying to monitor it. And as I mentioned, there are a number of international groups, including joint groups of environmentalists from Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, who are trying to monitor it and regularly report about it. So far in its official agenda, Russia still says we're still dedicated to environmental protection and we're still dedicated to climate legislation. We're part of the Paris Agreement and we'll stick to our climate goals, even though those climate goals have also been not very ambitious, I should say. But what we see in practice is that quite a lot of regulation is being rolled back. So we'll have to see what will be happening in the next few months. To sum it up and to maybe give you even more global outlook into the environmental and climate consequences of the war in Ukraine, you probably also read in the news the influence that the war in Ukraine is having on global food security. It is indeed that Russia and Ukraine have been global suppliers of quite a number of grains, mainly wheat, but not only, also rice and barley. And what we see, and also sunflower and sunflower seeds and sunflower oil in case of Ukraine. And what we've been seeing in the last few months is that on one hand, in case of Ukraine, the fields are being destroyed. We are in the middle of summer now in Europe, and that means that in many respects, the yield of this year, the agricultural yield, we will not get it in Ukraine, and so the production is due to fall by 30 to 40%. This is indeed very worrying news globally, but also for the country, for Ukraine in particular. So direct destruction of the fields, and for the farmers who are not able to proceed with further with managing their fields and further with the agricultural activities, it's obviously something which is very bad news, as I said, locally, regionally, and also globally. And military actions around the southern ports of Ukraine have also prevented many ships leaving the port, and there've also been use of Russian army seizing the ships and seizing the ships carrying grain to other parts of the world. So issues with the fields, like direct consequences and destruction of the fields, and issues with transportation, and also issues with embargoes, like on its side, Russia has introduced an embargo on wheat exports and rice exports recently, because it also sees global energy and global food and global grain market changing. So there are quite a lot of limitations coming into place. And all of this obviously makes the global food security situation not better. It is already a concern for many regions of the world, mostly countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but also countries in the Middle East. And likewise, along with the grain, we also see a similar turmoil in the area of fertilizer production. Here we see that both Russia and Belarus actually played a very important role in the global production of fertilizers. Here, the disruptions are mainly coming from international sanctions and the sanctions against particular producers in Russia and in Belarus. And once again, in a way, just to illustrate how the global world is interconnected and how problems in one part of the world is connected to problems and trends in other parts of the world. I do have very close interactions with quite a number of environmental journalists and experts, for example, in Brazil. And we've also been trying to monitor how decreased supply of grains and of fertilizers from Russia and from Belarus have led to the fact that some Latin American countries are now looking into increase in production of wheat and increase in production of fertilizers, which, however, can also mean more destruction of ecosystems, more deforestation, and more land grabbing also from indigenous communities. So in a way, we see the whole energy, the whole food market, the whole global, these two global markets being completely restructured as a result of the war in Ukraine, which Russia started in the end of February. I realized that it's probably not that much time left, so I feel like I would probably like to stop here, and I would be happy to answer any questions which you might have. And I do hope it was useful for you. I will share a link to the group that I mentioned, this group which combines many environmental experts and also journalists, environmental journalists from the three countries, so Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. We do publish our reports and issues, like special issues, in English and later in Russian and Ukrainian. And yes, thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Angelina. And I will read John's question in a second, but I just want you to give us a very short overview. At another lecture of yours that I listened to, you were saying that we all focus on oil and gas, but metals are also an issue. Can you just say something about the metals?
Right. Thank you for mentioning it, and also thank you for bringing what I feel to be a very important issue. Metals indeed are a crucial stone of the world economy. We use metals and we use products made from metals in our everyday life, from aluminum to steel. And the global decarbonization trend and the global energy transition will also require many more metals, various metals, like basic metals, also like aluminum and steel, but also rare metals and rare earth metals, lithium, copper, many other metals. And here, once again, Russia used to play and still plays a very important role as a global supplier of metals. With the metal companies, it's been a bit more complicated than with the energy companies. So some of the metal companies are under pressure and under sanctions. Some owners of the metal companies are also under sanctions. So some routes and some supply routes of Russian metals have also been disrupted. And what we see is that, once again, other buyers are stepping in. China is willing to buy more metals from Russia and also maybe then even reselling it later. Likewise, many other countries now are looking at other suppliers of metals, maybe also not from Russia. On the other hand, Russian producers of metals are also thinking that, well, hopefully when the war is over, they will probably be the ones who will see most of the sanctions against them lifted, because they are in a way finding themselves in a somewhat easier position than oil and gas producers. So I almost feel like whenever we speak both about energy transition and both about environmental and climate consequences of the war, it's quite important to look not only at oil and gas sectors, but also at metals, which I mentioned, but also at other sectors, for example, also wood products and wood. Russia has been and still remains to be a large global supplier of wood. And in the last few years, following European Union requirements for certification and the US requirements for certification, a lot of for Russian wood has been certified. Also, for example, there's this Forest Certification Stewardship Council, the FSC. They've been working very actively in Russia and in a way introduced new sustainable practices into forest management, into production of wood and wood products. Now, what do we see since the beginning of the war? Here's once again, FSC declared that they live in Russia. Most Russian exports of wood and wood products to Europe and to the US have been put on hold, on pause, or that the trade deals have been canceled. And so now once again, we see that most of Russian wood and wood products is now being redirected towards China. And China does have a very big demand for wood coming from Russia. However, China also has far lower environmental regulation in terms of wood exports. And basically the whole question of wood origin and wood certification is of a lesser interest in these bilateral trade deals. So in a way, what we see, the wood market is also being reshaped. And here we also have to see how will that influence the sustainability factor in forest management and production of wood and production of wood products.
Thank you very much. I will read the question of John Dunn, who is a professor in Cambridge, and please just raise your hand if you want to ask a live question. The question is, obviously, there is no possibility of serious mitigation of the disastrous environmental deterioration within Russia unless and until Russia has a more responsible and effective government. Supposing, very optimistically, that at some future point that were to happen, what are the real possibilities for slowing or even halting the melting of permafrost and controlling or stopping the vast forest fires?
Thank you for the question. I fully agree that in an ideal world, for the war in Ukraine to be finished, and also for Russia to be turning more towards environmental and more towards pro-environmental and pro-climate agenda in its domestic policies, towards strategies, towards policies, but also towards actions, we would need a completely different political structure within Russia. However, having what we have now, and thinking about the fact that all of this which you mentioned, including forest fires and melting permafrost and melting Arctic is still there, somehow global environment and global climate community is faced with a really big question, like what happens with this and how can we possibly stop that, and are there any technologies or any solutions available, and also can there be, and what kind of environmental and climate cooperation can the world, can also the West have with Russia with this respect? Speaking more specifically about mitigating forest fires and melting permafrost, well, unfortunately, with the current trends, and more particular with the weather becoming warmer and with the climate becoming warmer in the Arctic, and with the climate becoming warmer and drier in Siberia and southern Siberia, and with the changing patterns of the changing atmospheric patterns, and so less rainfall, for example, coming in Siberia from early spring to late fall, what we see is these trends are accumulating, and we experience more fierce and more vast forest fires. It's on one hand, this trend does have, as I mentioned, reasons connected with climate change. It also has reasons connected with sustainable forestry management. And with that respect, for the last few years, environmentalists and scientists have been calling on for Russia to introduce more sustainable forest management and also more fire prevention policies and fire prevention strategies. So far, what's happening is that most forest fires are being dealt with if they produce an immediate danger to human settlements. And very little is being done in the area of fire prevention, including sustainable forest management. And unfortunately, what we see now, and also what I mentioned in my previous answer, the fact that we probably will not see more sustainable forestry practices in Russia in the next few years, I'm afraid it also doesn't mean good news for the forest fires. I mean, on the official agenda, Russia says, and also the regional government keep reporting that they keep fighting forest fires, also the one taking place now. However, it's quite obvious that there is already a lack of finance for preventing forest fires, and we'll have to see with the economic crisis looming, we'll have to see whether there'll be enough financing to invest in forest fire prevention and also forest fire fighting. And as I said, with the state environmental control on decline, and also huge complications for civil society control, NGO work in the area, international cooperation in the area, unfortunately, it might not be very good news for the Russian forest sector in general, and for the sector of forest fires in particular. With regard to permafrost, well, it's a very complicated question. It's melting permafrost is probably also one of the so-called tipping points, one of the turning points within the global climate system, which is also is a very dramatic example of the so-called positive feedback reaction. So the warmer the climate gets, the more the permafrost melts, or so in a way, what we see, and probably a few words about how the permafrost is melting. First of all, around 2/3 of Russian territory, more or less considered to be like frozen grounds. Some of these areas are frozen all over the year. Some of these areas are frozen only in winter, and then in summer they melt. I mean, that was the usual procedure. So what happens now is that we see on one hand that, for example, some areas which have been frozen both in winter and in summer are not frozen at all. And so the level of the soil which has been frozen is just like earth now, and we see various processes taking part in this area, and also a lot of methane and CO2 being released from the melting permafrost. And what can be done? It's an open question. I don't think global community and global scientific community has come with any particular solution to this issue. A number of companies, also companies working in permafrost areas, have been trying to adapt to this and, for example, build the infrastructure in recent years so that it can also be resilient to the possible melting of permafrost, and working in conditions when particular grounds were frozen and they were solid, and now they're not solid, they're not frozen, they're not solid, they're more kind of liquid, and they're more that obviously changes the way infrastructure can function in these conditions, and it influences industrial infrastructure, including extracting infrastructure, and it also influences urban infrastructure. There's not a lot of urban infrastructure built on permafrost in Russia. However, there's still some, and even quite a number of what I would say large cities, include Norilsk is probably, or quite around cities around Yamal or around Taimyr Peninsula. They're all built on permafrost. So a really big question is adapting to permafrost. But whether we can stop it and whether there are any technical solutions, I'm afraid there are not that many. There have been some scientific experiments, and one of the scientific experiments is called the Pleistocene Park. You can take a look at it. It's an experiment by two Russian scientists, a father and a son, in the north of Yakutia. And so their idea is that if we take tundra landscapes and we try to rewild them with large mammals, so the mammals which used to live there for many hundreds of thousands of years, that will bring more green cover, and that will also help protect some of the permafrost in the area. And I also wrote extensively about the project. It's a very interesting scientific experiment, which was also taking place with very intense cooperation with American scientists and German scientists. However, again, the future is what will the future of this project be, and also whether it can be scaled up to other parts of the world and other parts of the permafrost areas, so the Pleistocene Park. Yes, I think I'll probably stop here.
Thank you, Angelina. Eugen Simonov, please go ahead and please introduce yourself.
Oh, I am Eugene Simonov, a Russian environmentalist and foreign agent, currently residing at University of New South Wales, Canberra. My question is about the environmental effects of sanctions, because does it, to a certain extent, fire back on countries in terms of them not being able to introduce some environmental policies, imposing sanction regime? Does it have an environmentally negative effects on those who impose it? And are there ways to make sanction regime greener? So is it feasible in this warring world to make warring parties to be mindful of negative effects they both don't like?
Thank you very much, Eugene. Angelina, I will ask Sarah also to ask a question because we have 10 minutes left. Sarah, please, could you introduce yourself as well? Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Sarah Emminger. I'm living in Vienna.
We cannot hear you. A bit louder.
Can you hear me at
Yeah.
all? Or
yes,
okay.
yes.
Okay. I'm a journalist working at the Austrian Press Agency. And my question is, what are your thoughts on the recent EU taxonomy vote?
Thank you. Angelina, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mariana. Evgeny, it's good to see you. I was actually, I kept mentioning this joint working group, so Ukraine War Environmental Consequences Working Group, and Evgeny is also part of this group. So we're working jointly with on monitoring environmental consequences of the war and also trying to look up at possible solutions, including the green recovery of Ukraine. So with a question about consequences of the sanctions for environmental regulation.
And are there green sanctions?
Sorry?
What Eugen said also was, is it possible to have green sanctions?
Right. Well, in an ideal world, would probably have sanctions to be very finely tuned and targeting just particular people and particular companies and particular areas and industries. However, what we have been experiencing in the last few months and actually the last few years and throughout the recent history of the sanctions applied not only against Russian current conditions, but also against other countries. Unfortunately, it's very challenging to introduce very finely tuned sanctions. And it's also very often that the sanctions are being introduced against large producers and owners of the companies, but also particular sectors of the economy. But as a follow-up effect, they affect many areas of life and many areas of economic activities and also well-being of people in the country in general. So in a way, it's a very tough question. How can you sanction more precisely, and how can you maybe green sanctions in a way? I mean, a very obvious question here would probably be, yes, we put embargo on oil and gas deliveries from Russia, but then we do not stop supplies of Western green technologies or clean technologies to Russia. This is also what has been happening now. For example, there are quite a few issues with monitoring equipment for industrial pollution, which was coming to Russia and which was mostly produced elsewhere. So we already see lack of it, and this is also one of the reasons being mentioned in pushing a lot of Russian regulation, environmental regulation forward. For example, what we've been seeing in the last 2 years is that Russia has been trying to introduce a system which is similar to the one used in the European Union. It's called the best available technologies. That meant that a particular enterprise was introducing the best available technologies, including green technologies. They would be free from payments on environmental, on pollution and on discharges into water and into air. And at the same time, the companies and the polluters had to install this very special monitoring equipment, which would in real time inform the state agencies and the public about environmental pollution. So what we see now is that many companies are saying, but now we cannot buy this equipment anymore. It's not being delivered to Russia. And since it's not being delivered, we cannot comply with this legislation. And that also means we will have to push the dates, we have to push the deadlines forward. We cannot do it now. Likewise, quite a number of international investors in the area of renewable energy in Russia, including Fortum and Enel, have also withdrawn from the country, which will possibly be another serious hurdle on the way to renewable energy development in Russia, which was taking place to a certain extent on a very modest level. However, there have been some local developments of both the producers of equipment for the sector and also development of solar and wind generation in Russia. So as I said, in an ideal world, it will have to be very finely tuned. However, now also in current conditions when the war has been with us for 4.5 months and some decisions have to be taken very quickly and agreed very quickly between various actors. And in the case of European Union, those are all the members of the European Union. So unfortunately, we cannot see them very finely tuned. And just to repeat, just off the top of my head, I would say that for the sanctions to be greener, they would probably have to be tackling more of oil and gas production coming from Russia, and also technologies relating to oil and gas productions, and obviously the military sector, and obviously sector against particular individuals also against and engaged in military activities or decisions about them. However, they would probably have to be dealing less with the sector of green technologies and technological development and many other aspects of green development. However, it should also be noted that in some cases, all these areas which I mentioned, including the clean technologies and the green technologies, they came as a result, not of the result of the sanctions, but as a result of the so-called self-sanctioning of many companies. When companies were declaring that they live in Russia, not because they have to, but because they do it out of reputational reasons, like they don't consider it to be morally acceptable to be present in Russia or to be trading in Russia. And so they declare, we are living in Russia now. And that happens, as I said, not because of the sanction packages, but because the companies decided on their own. And some companies and some Western companies are also leaving Russia because they cannot secure their supply chains in current conditions. And they think it's also economically more viable to leave now, both economically and reputationally. So some of this, as I said, is not coming from the side of sanctions, but coming from the side of self-sanctioning of companies, which actually makes me think that maybe together with a number of other environmental experts and journalists, we should probably prepare an overview of something of how sanctions and also self-sanctions can be greener. but it's something for the more of a work for the future and like.
And the second question, Angelina, of Sarah.
Yes, Sarah. Yeah, and so the second question was about the EU taxonomy. And the fact that nuclear energy and natural gas have been included in the EU taxonomy. Well, I would probably comment on this question once again from the Russian perspective, and I think from the Russian perspective, it obviously looks very good. From the Russian perspective, it looks like well, you see the natural gas is being recognized as a green or at least transition fuel. So it's something which we've been saying on for years. It's something which Russia and Russian gas companies have been pushing in for years and saying that, look, natural gas is a transition fuel, is a bridge fuel. We have to support it, and it's much better than the coal. So let's stick to it. So I would say, and likewise for nuclear energy, Russia already has a certain share of nuclear energy, and Russian state energy company, Rosatom, has been very much interested in supplying the fuel and also technologies abroad, and actually building nuclear power plants all over the world, in some parts of Europe, but also in some parts of Africa and other places. And here, once again, the reaction was very positive. Like Russia also stands for natural gas and for nuclear. So the reaction within Russia was mainly about, so you see, we've been telling you about this. Now we're cut off because of the sanctions, but the European Union still turning towards nuclear energy and towards natural gas. Now, what more can I say about it? I don't think it's very good news for the energy transition, because a lot of resources will be redirected to natural gas, or probably mostly in form of LNG at the moment in the European Union. And a lot of resources will be, and technologies and efforts and money will be redirected to nuclear and to natural gas, both of which are somewhat arguable and controversial sources in current times of decarbonization. I can only hope it will not stay for long, and it is just a temporary measure to really quickly adapt to the changing conditions. But yeah, the situation is like this.
Are there any more questions? If not, I have a very general question to someone who is not an expert. And the question is, how come people like myself who deal with politics and media are a lot more aware, or were a lot more aware, of saving the Amazon rather than saving the Russian forest as well? Amazon is always in the media. Even artists dedicate concerts to saving the Amazon forest. But I don't recall before the war any concert saving the Russian forest or saving the Arctic. How do you explain that? We have like 1 minute.
Well, I would say that, well, first of all, 2 years ago, when there were also very fierce forest fires in Siberia, I think there was a campaign by Leonardo DiCaprio, who also started a campaign of fighting with forest fires. I would say less international information was available. Also, Russia, I think, as a country, and was less interested in international cooperation in this area, particularly in the last years. There was a lot about political involvement and like telling Russia what to do also in the area of forests. And I think in general, like if in case of Amazon, like the main problems would be connected to deforestation. In case of Russian forests, it will also be a bit more complicated. It will be more about mismanagement of Russian forests and not enough forest fire prevention being done as probably the main reasons, along with the climate change, for forest fires.
I see. Well, Angelina, thank you so much. Thank you to all the participants. We have only scratched the surface of the surface of the surface. Those of you who are journalists, if you want to discuss more with Angelina, I will be happy to give you her contact. I hope we don't have, you all have a rather nice summer. This is our last event. We shall start in September again, this time with an event on Sweden and the elections and security. And I just hope the summer is not so hot as it is, they're telling us it is going to be, because it is going to, there will be so many problems together, the war, the heat, energy, all of it together. But at least we tried to give the basic information with wonderful experts. And I hope to have you, Angelina, very soon in Vienna in person. Thank you all very, very much. And until September. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, like, we're allowed to quote Angelina in our...
Yeah, it is on the record.
Okay, good.
It is on the record, sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.